When we're looking at our role and responsibility towards stakeholders and shareholders, something that's taken much more prominence in recent times is looking there at corporate and social responsibility. So when we're going through and making our economic decisions in terms of what projects we're going to go through and investing throughout this course, what we need to go through and do is we need to ensure that not only are those projects maximising our shareholder wealth, our main corporate objective, but we need to think about what impact those projects are having on the environment around us and also what impact they have on some of your key stakeholders. So thinking there about your customers, maybe your suppliers, and maybe also your employees. So what we're going to focus on first is what's referred to as your sustainability and environmental risk. What you'll go through and find here is that the main aim, as we've said, is to increase your shareholders' wealth. So we're looking there at growth within a business. We're trying to go through there and generate more profits, which can be converted into cash flows to help that company generate more cash for the shareholders. However, what we need to go through and do there is we need to balance that growth. So when we're balancing that growth, we need to balance that growth there with your economic, your social and your environmental concerns. What we go through and see now is the fact that many different companies are focusing more and more and more upon their sustainability and the environmental risk that they are posing in their day-to-day operations. What you will find now is that many companies report annually on their corporate and social responsibility. You will go through there and you will see that there is a narrative that goes through and looks at the nature and the extent of what a company is doing in terms of balancing its growth with its economic, social and environmental needs. If you were to go through and have a look at particular companies, you can go through and get on the internet and have a look at corporate responsibility for any particularly large company. And that's probably the best way to go through and look at this part of the syllabus. If you go through, Google corporate responsibility for any given company that you know that is local to you, you'll be able to go through and have a look at what that company is actually doing to try and balance its growth with its economic, environmental and social responsibilities. What you'll also find is that some companies have gone to the extent of setting up separate lines of business to go through and ensure that they manage their growth with their sustainability. So as an example, if you go through and look at British Airways and look at its corporate responsibility, British Airways has set up a separate part of its business that's referred to there as One Direction. One Direction goes through there and looks at British Airways and how it can be sustainable in the future. It's a major global airline. It's there polluting the atmosphere as it goes through and uses its jets to fly people around the world. But what it wants to go through and do is it wants to make sure that even though people know that British Airways is polluting the environment, it's doing its bit to make sure that it reduces the level of pollution that it is making. So what One Destination does is when you're looking there at British Airways, it goes through there and splits out its focus into what it's doing with the environment, what it's doing there with the local communities in which it operates, and also there what it is doing within the marketplace. So it's not just focusing there upon reducing your carbon emissions. It's also going through there and starting to think about what you can do to help the local community. British Airways flies as a global airline to much poorer parts of the world in Africa, South America and Asia. Again, it wants to be able to generate growth in those regions, it wants to be able to bring employment to those regions, but it's got to go through there and think about the local community. It will offer local community projects to get people involved on a day-to-day basis with how the company is run, so that people can go through and reap the benefits of a major multinational company expanding into their local area. Another large multinational company that is growing ever bigger is a supermarket in the UK known as Tesco. Again, Tesco has its own corporate responsibility report every single year, and what Tesco goes through and focuses upon in its corporate and social responsibility report is, again, right at the top of the list is they're looking at the environment. Again, similar to what you have there within British Airways, Tesco also goes through there and looks at the local communities. So Tesco goes through and does some voucher schemes every so often, whereby if you spend so much on food shopping, your local school will get vouchers maybe towards sports equipment or maybe towards some form of computer equipment. Again, it's doing its local thing for the economy. What we also have as well is Tesco goes through there and looks at how it buys and sells its products. So again, to try and minimise, if you like, waste. It doesn't want to go through and waste any products that it buys if it cannot sell them. It wants to make sure as well that it goes through and sources either one, local produce, or two, produce that, if it's being imported from overseas, doesn't have too much of an impact on the company's carbon footprint. It also wants to go through and think about some more of its stakeholders. So you and I, the consumers of the food that Tesco go through and sell. They want to try and promote healthy living. They want to go through and ensure that we live the longer, we eat better quality food, and we eat the right type of food. And then last but by no means least, Tesco has a fifth one which goes through there and looks at another stakeholder group, being the employees, as they like to go through and refer to as our people. Again, they want to make sure that there is no discrimination within the workplace, that people have equal opportunities. As we said before, it's a good idea just to go through and pick out a particular company. So here, all I've done is pick out Tesco's. You can go through www.tesco.com and then search its corporate responsibility. Alternatively, you can go to British Airways, www.ba.com, and again go through and search its corporate responsibility. It's a great idea to look at it for these two companies, look at it for other companies that you may know, just to give you an idea of what these companies are trying to achieve. Because what you're likely to get within the exam is you might have an MPV project appraisal question. You may have a question that goes through and looks at a business valuation. Again, what you may need to do, once you've dealt with the numbers, is then to go through and start thinking about the sustainability and the environmental risk that this project is susceptible to. Following on from looking at sustainability and environmental risks, we're now going to go through there and focus upon carbon trading and emissions. Because when companies go through and operate on a day-to-day basis, as soon as you turn on your computer, that is using energy. That energy is likely to have come from coal or gas-supplied electricity. That there is not sustaining the environment. It's putting more carbon into the environment. If you think about British Airways that we mentioned before, every time that British Airways flies passengers from Heathrow in London over to New York, that aeroplane is going through there and polluting the environment by emitting carbon. If you think there about Tesco's, Tesco's are going through there, refrigerating their products, lighting their stores, powering the tills by electricity. Again, that is there going through and putting more carbon into the environment. What governments have done following the Kyoto Protocol is trying to go through there and minimise the amount of carbon that companies are putting into the environment. Why? Because the more carbon that goes into the environment, the more that contributes towards global warming, and now we start talking more about climate change. The recent activities that have been around the world in terms of floods, fire, a lot of it is down to global warming. So what has been put in place is looking at a world of what's referred to now as carbon trading, because different companies emit different amounts of carbon into the atmosphere. If you think about British Airways, that will probably put more carbon into the atmosphere maybe than Tesco's. But if you go through and think about a large electricity or gas company, they're burning carbon at a rate of millions and millions of tonnes per day. So what we go through and do there is we start to look at the amount of carbon that these companies emit, and first of all try to reduce the amount of carbon. So what governments have gone through and done is they've gone and started dealing in what we refer to as carbon trading, whereby all they go through and do is they hand out tradable rights. So if you are a big industrial polluter, the more that you pollute, the more that you have to go through and pay for the benefit of using that carbon. So first of all, that's going to reduce the amount, hopefully, that these big emitters will pump into the environment. Why? Because they don't want to pay for the rights to use that carbon. What then happens on the other side is if people go through and use less carbon than what they have been given based upon their rights, well, they will go through and then receive some cash. Where does that cash come from? Well, that comes there from the big or the large industrial polluters. So if you are there as a low polluter, you can generate cash. If you're there as a big polluter, you have to pay cash. But again, the incentive there is to reduce your carbon emissions, so you pay less cash or potentially you receive more cash. You may have heard companies talking about being carbon neutral. Carbon neutral there is all about, again, trying to reduce the amount of carbon that you put into the atmosphere, to get to a point whereby you balance off the amount of carbon that you put into the atmosphere with looking there at the amount of carbon that you put back into the atmosphere. Now, how does that work? How do you actually go through and put carbon back into the atmosphere? It's very difficult to do. Well, what we go through and do there is, in order to ensure that you put carbon back into the atmosphere, you can go through and contribute cash to energy-saving projects. So you can go through there and invest some of your company's cash in, say, wind farms, solar farms, which go through and use less carbon. So in effect, you are putting more carbon back into the atmosphere. Many companies are setting themselves targets. On that Tesco website, I think that Tesco are looking to be carbon neutral by something like 2050. Again, it's trying to set targets to ensure that it will meet that ultimate target of putting no carbon into the atmosphere and making the world a better place. From an exam perspective, again, it's just something that you need to think about. When you're looking at your project, does it go through and use more carbon? Does it use less carbon? It's not going to be a big area within the exam, but it's something that you need to give in terms of consideration. If we go back and look at our sustainability that we first started the session off with, what we have in the UK to ensure that companies are sustainable, so balancing growth with your environmental and economic and social concerns, is we have the Environmental Agency. It's a government-run department. And what this department wants to go through and do is just protect the world or the country in which we live in, with respect to looking at land, water that is used on a day-to-day basis. You know, we want to ensure the water that we are drinking is of a good, safe quality. We want to make sure that if we're at the seaside, the water that we're bathing in is safe to go through and bathe in. If we are building houses, we want to make sure that the land that we're constructing those houses upon is safe, that it hasn't been contaminated. So that's the first role of the Environment Agency in the UK, to protect the land, the sea and the environment that we live in. Second role of the Environment Agency is to go through there and start to help new businesses, developing businesses, with their environmental and sustainability needs. It's there to offer advice. If we look in a little bit more detail at what the Environment Agency does, and if you go on the website and have a look at it in more detail, it roughly covers 5 major areas that they look at. First one, I think, is something that you may need with respect to your exam. It's looking there at environmental permitting. All that this involves is looking at applications whereby you are a company that may pollute the environment. So examples that you're looking at within the exam are thinking there, do you get involved in chemical waste, mining waste, maybe there's some radioactivity and radioactive waste, because you will need to go through and dispose of that waste. You will need a permit that regulates the amount that you are allowed to put into the environment as waste, if you like, safe levels. So in your exam, you need to think, do I need to apply for an environmental permit based upon the project that we are taking on board? Other bits that you've got that the Environment Agency looks at are thinking about floods. You know, UK, it's an island. Technically speaking, the United Kingdom isn't. Britain is an island. And what you've got there is you need to think there about floods. You know, the Environment Agency is there about creating flood defences and maintaining flood defences. So again, if you're thinking about it from an exam perspective, very difficult really to think. You know, maybe you're setting up your business close to the sea, close to rivers, maybe, maybe not, but you might have to think there, what are the level of flood defences that are put in place? Third thing that we're looking at there, I think more relevant towards your exam, is looking there at your pollutions and emissions. Because here, what we're going to see is the fact that the Environment Agency is responsible there for maintaining that level of pollution and emissions. It wants, as we said, to keep it at a safe level. They've gone through and issued an environmental permit. They need to make sure that you are sticking to the levels, the limits that have been given within that environmental permit. The second to last one that we have there is looking at waste. Again, that's looking there at the regulation of landfills or maybe some special waste that might be specific to your business. Again, just have a bit of a think about an exam-focused perspective of how your project may impact the level of waste that you are putting into the environment. Last one there is going through and looking at water. Again, all the Environment Agency is doing there, as we said before, is trying to protect the levels of pollution that go into our water, our drinking water and our seas. We want to make sure that we're not drinking contaminated water or bathing in contaminated seas. Don't worry too much about this area with respect to the exam. I can't see it being a huge area that would crop up. You know, 3, 4, maybe 5 marks maximum. Just knowing what the Environment Agency does and then specifically how that might be used in relation to any projects that your business invests within. Another aspect in respect of your role and responsibility to stakeholders is looking there at environmental audits. Again, it's something that you need to consider within your business decision. You may need an environmental audit. Why? Well, all you're trying to do there is trying to reduce the potential liability that your company may have if things were to go wrong. So what you're looking at there is how we can get a set of external auditors in to come through and give us an idea of how a company is doing in terms of its energy saving. Is it going through and meeting its targets? Could it go through and improve upon its energy saving initiatives? Other aspects of an environmental audit are going through there and looking at waste reduction. Again, your external auditors are going to come through and see whether or not you've met your targets, and then whether or not you can see rooms for improvement and where that improvement may be made. The last point there is looking at your business processes, looking at how the business operates on a day-to-day basis. Where does it source its supplies from? Where does it sell its goods to? How does the manufacturing process work? And can that be improved in any particular way to ensure that we reduce the potential for any liability? So are we using reputable suppliers? Are we selling to customers that aren't going to go through and pollute the environment? You know, we're not just thinking here about liabilities in terms of financial terms, but also think about it in terms of reputational or brand awareness terms. You don't want to be going through and selling your products to irresponsible customers who are going to go through there and then damage your brand name once you become associated with that business. We can then look at it from a similar perspective with your suppliers. You don't want to go through and supply your goods from a business that is not acting socially or economically or environmentally sound. Again, these are all things that you just need to think about when you're trying to manage the business on behalf of your shareholders and your stakeholders. It's a non-numerical part of the syllabus. It's written. It should be relatively good scoring marks within the exam.